I'll never forget the night my family's world changed forever. My grandfather, Henry Thompson, sold his cattle ranch for $4.2 million. He didn't keep a dime for himself. Every penny went to my father, David, because Grandpa trusted him more than anyone. His only request was simple. He looked at my dad with tired eyes and said, "Take care of me." That was it. That was the deal. But money has a way of showing who people really are. My dad promised he would keep Grandpa safe, that he'd make sure he never had to worry again. My mom, Margaret Maggie, smiled and believed him because she always did. She was the kind of woman who stood by her husband no matter what. And then there was me, Ethan, watching everything unfold, trying to believe the best in my father, even when I started to notice cracks in the promise. For a while, it seemed like things were fine. But then came that one freezing winter night. My father, the man Grandpa had trusted with everything, pushed him out into the cold like he was nothing. That image is burned into my memory. My grandfather standing on the back porch with his old coat pulled tight, shivering his breath turning to frost in the air, while my father shut the door on him. I made a choice that night. I took my grandfather in when my own father wouldn't. And months later, when Grandpa passed away in my care, I thought the pain of losing him would be the hardest part of the story. I was wrong, because when we sat in the lawyer's office to hear Grandpa's final wishes, something was revealed that left the entire room in silence. I grew up believing my grandfather, Henry Thompson, was the strongest man alive. He wasn't just a rancher. He was the heartbeat of our family. His cattle ranch stretched across miles of open land in western Montana. The fences seemed endless, and the sky above felt bigger there than anywhere else in the world. I spent my childhood running across that land, feeding calves, chasing after barn cats, and listening to Grandpa's voice carry over the wind as he gave orders to the ranch hands. Grandpa was tough, but his toughness was paired with an incredible kindness. He never raised his voice at me. When I made mistakes, he didn't scold me. He guided me. Once, when I accidentally left the barn door open and a calf wandered out, I thought I was done for. But instead of yelling, Grandpa knelt down, looked me in the eyes, and said, "Ethan, a man learns best from mistakes. What matters is that you own it and fix it." We walked out together, brought the calf back, and I never forgot that lesson. My father, David, was different. He was ambitious, sharp, and always thinking about money. Where Grandpa saw land and cattle as a way of life, my father saw them as numbers. He grew up working the ranch, too, but he never seemed to love it. When I was a kid, I could see the resentment in him. He hated the long days, the dirt under his nails, the endless repairs and unpredictability of ranch life. Mom used to tell me that Dad dreamed of getting out of having something bigger, something easier. He didn't want to live the way his father had. Mom. Maggie balanced the two men in my life. She was quiet but strong in her own way. She stood by Dad, but she adored Grandpa. She grew up in a small town nearby and married Dad young. She often said Grandpa felt like the father she had lost too soon. She would sit with him on the porch in the evenings, sipping sweet tea while the sun went down, listening to his stories as if they were treasures. I was 23 when everything started to unravel. Grandpa was in his late 70s, and though his spirit was unshakable, his body was slowing down. Years of early mornings hard labor and Montana winters had taken their toll. I noticed the way his hands trembled when he lifted a coffee cup and how his steps grew shorter. He pretended he was fine, but I knew better. He was proud, and pride runs deep in men like him. Then came the day he made the choice none of us expected. He gathered us around the kitchen table, his voice steady but serious. "I'm selling the ranch," he said. The words landed like a thunderclap. I looked at him, stunned. That land had been in our family for generations. It wasn't just a home, it was a legacy. My father's eyes lit up immediately, though, and I saw something in his expression I couldn't quite describe at the time. "Dad, are you sure?" Mom asked gently. "I'm sure," Grandpa replied.
The ranch deserves better than to fade under my hands as I grow old, and I want to make sure the people I love are taken care of." Weeks later, the papers were signed and the ranch was gone. When the sale closed, Grandpa called us into the lawyer's office. I sat beside him as he handed over every penny, all $4.2 million, to my father. Grandpa didn't keep a single cent for himself. He placed his entire future in my father's hands. "David," he said softly, looking my dad straight in the eye, "I'm giving this to you. I don't need wealth for myself. All I ask is that you take care of me. That's all I want." My father smiled, clapping his dad on the shoulder. "Of course, Dad. You'll never have to worry. You've earned this rest." On the surface, it seemed like a perfect arrangement. My father now had money to build the future he wanted, and Grandpa could relax after a lifetime of sacrifice. But deep down, something didn't sit right with me. I remembered the look in Dad's eyes when the money landed in his lap. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't love. It was hunger. The kind of hunger that blinds men to everything else. Still, I tried to convince myself that maybe I was overthinking it. I told myself Dad would honor his word. Grandpa trusted him. And if Grandpa could trust him, then maybe I could too. I focused on my own life, working odd jobs and trying to save for college. But I kept one eye on my father and how he handled his new fortune. At first, things looked fine. My father bought a bigger house, a nicer truck, and new furniture for my mom. He made investments and spoke proudly of building a future for our family. He even set Grandpa up in the guest room of the new house. But little by little, the cracks began to show. Dad's patience with Grandpa grew thinner. The once respected man who had given up everything became in my father's eyes nothing more than a burden. I didn't realize it then, but that decision to hand over everything would be the spark that lit a fire of betrayal none of us could put out. Grandpa had trusted his son with all he had. He thought love would be enough. He thought blood would mean loyalty. What he didn't know was that the same blood could also run cold. And soon we would all learn just how cold my father's heart could become. At first I tried to believe my father would live up to his promise. Grandpa had given him everything, and surely that had to mean something. For a little while, it even seemed like it did. Grandpa settled into the guest room of our new house, and Dad made a point of telling people he was taking care of his father. He said it proudly at church, at family gatherings, even to neighbors who stopped by to see the new truck parked in the driveway. But behind closed doors, the truth was different. The first cracks appeared in small ways. Dad would sigh loudly whenever Grandpa asked for help with simple tasks like reaching a glass from the cabinet or getting his medicine. "You can do it yourself," Dad would mutter under his breath, though he thought no one was listening. But I heard him, and so did Grandpa. I saw the hurt flicker in his eyes, though he tried to hide it with a weak smile. One evening after dinner, Grandpa accidentally spilled water across the table. My father's reaction was instant and cruel. "For God's sake, Dad, can't you even hold a cup anymore?" "You're like a child." Mom tried to smooth things over, wiping the spill and gently saying it was no big deal. But the damage was done. Grandpa sat in silence, staring down at his weathered hands. His shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. As weeks passed, my father's frustration turned into something sharper. He began staying out late, telling Mom he was busy with business meetings. When he was home, he made excuses to avoid being around Grandpa. I started to notice how he referred to him not as Dad, but as the old man. It chilled me. This was the same man who had given him millions, the man who had built the foundation of our family, reduced to a burden in his own son's eyes. One night I confronted Dad. I found him sitting in his office papers spread across the desk. "Why are you treating Grandpa this way?" I asked. "He gave you everything. Don't you think you owe him respect?" Dad looked up at me, his eyes cold.
Respect doesn't pay bills, Ethan.
He chose to give me the money. That was his decision. I didn't force him, and now he expects me to put my whole life on hold to babysit him. I won't do it. The words hit me like a punch. He's your father, I said quietly. One day you'll regret this. Dad leaned back in his chair and laughed bitterly. Regret doesn't build futures either. You're young. You'll understand someday. Life isn't about sentiment. It's about progress. And sometimes progress means leaving the weak behind. I walked out of that room sick to my stomach. I wanted to believe there was still some shred of love left in him, but his words echoed in my head for days. The final straw came during the coldest week of winter. The snow outside piled high and the wind howled against the house. The heating system struggled to keep up, and every room felt like ice. That night I woke to raised voices coming from downstairs. I crept to the top of the stairs and listened. "I'm tired of this, Dad," my father shouted. "I've done enough. You can't even get through a night without complaining. I'm not your nurse. You're dragging this family down." Grandpa's voice was shaky but firm. "I gave you everything I had, David. All I asked was a roof and a little kindness. Is that too much for a son?" My father's reply was venomous. "Yes, it is. I didn't ask for this responsibility. I didn't want it. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." I heard the back door swing open and the rush of freezing air pour inside. I bolted down the stairs just as my father shoved Grandpa out onto the porch. The old man staggered, clutching his coat tight, his breath rising in white clouds. My father's face was stone as he said, "Find somewhere else to go." Then he slammed the door shut. For a moment I stood frozen in the kitchen, my heart hammered in my chest, torn between the father who had raised me and the grandfather who had taught me what love really meant. The silence was unbearable. Then Grandpa turned his eyes, meeting mine through the glass. His lips were blue, his body shaking from the cold. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. I grabbed my coat and ran outside, wrapping my arm around him. "You're coming with me," I said firmly. He tried to protest, whispering, "I don't want to be a burden, Ethan." But I wouldn't hear it. "You're not a burden. You're my family, and I'll take care of you the way you took care of me." Behind us, the lights inside the house flickered. Shadows moved across the curtains where my father stood watching. I didn't care. That night, I chose my grandfather over my father. I chose love over greed. And I knew that choice would change everything. When I led Grandpa away from that porch into the freezing night, I had no idea how much my life was about to change. I didn't think about money, about family politics, or about the risks of defying my father. All I thought about was the man shivering beside me, the man who had carried me on his shoulders as a boy, who had taught me to mend fences and drive cattle, who had given his only son everything he owned in exchange for a promise of care. That promise had been broken, and I wasn't going to let him face the cold alone. We walked to my beat-up truck parked at the curb. The engine coughed to life as I cranked the ignition and the heater groaned, barely pushing out warm air. Grandpa sat beside me, bundled in his old coat, his hands trembling not just from the cold, but from exhaustion. For the first few miles, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people carrying wounds that words could not immediately heal. Finally, Grandpa broke it. His voice was low, almost ashamed. "You don't have to do this, Ethan. I won't hold it against you if you take me back." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "I'm not taking you back. You're staying with me. You deserve better than what he did to you tonight." He shook his head slowly. I never thought I'd see the day my own son turned me out. Maybe I was a fool for trusting him. I looked over at him, his face worn and tired in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "You weren't a fool, Grandpa. You believed in him because he was your son. That's not foolish. That's love. But he made his choice, and now I'm making mine. I brought him to my small apartment above the hardware store where I worked part-time. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a bathroom, but it was warm, and it was ours. I gave him my bed that night and slept on the couch. He tried to argue, but I wouldn't hear it. "You raised me to be a man," I told him. "This is what a man does." The weeks that followed were hard. Supporting both of us meant picking up a second job at the gas station down the road. I worked long hours stocking shelves, pumping fuel, and running deliveries. Money was tight, but I stretched every dollar. Groceries were simple beans, rice bread, and the occasional meat when I could afford it. Grandpa never complained. In fact, he often apologized. One evening, as I set down 2 bowls of soup on the table, he said quietly, "I feel like I'm dragging you down, Ethan. You should be out living your life, not stuck here taking care of me." I sat across from him and shook my head. "You're not dragging me down. You're giving me a reason to push harder. Taking care of you isn't a burden. It's an honor. You've given me more than I can ever repay. This is the least I can do." Tears welled in his eyes, and he quickly wiped them away with the back of his hand. "You're more of a son to me than my own boy has been in years." That moment cemented our bond in a way I hadn't expected. We became a team navigating our new life together. During my breaks, I'd take him for short walks around the block. His steps were slow, but he never stopped trying. On days when I was home, we'd sit by the window and he'd tell me stories about the ranch, about the early mornings branding cattle, the storms that nearly swept away entire herds, and the nights he spent under the stars with nothing but a blanket and his horse for company. "Those were hard times," he said one afternoon, his voice filled with nostalgia. "But I'd take them again in a heartbeat. Hard work makes a man proud. Easy living makes him soft." I listened, soaking in every word. I realized then that these weren't just stories. They were lessons passed down like heirlooms. He wanted me to carry the spirit of the ranch even if the land was gone. As winter turned to spring, I noticed his health declining. The tremors in his hands grew worse, and some days he struggled to get out of bed. Still, he never once complained. He'd smile at me when I came home from work, even if his body ached. And every night before bed, he'd say, "Thank you, Ethan. You'll never know what this means to me." I knew then that my decision had been the right one. I couldn't change my father's choices, but I could honor my grandfather with mine. What mattered wasn't the size of our home or the balance in our bank account. What mattered was that he knew he wasn't alone, that someone still saw his worth. It wasn't easy. There were days I thought I couldn't keep going, days when exhaustion nearly crushed me. But then I'd look at Grandpa sitting in the chair by the window humming an old country tune. And I'd remember why I was doing it. He wasn't just my grandfather. He was my teacher, my friend, my family. And no matter what, I was going to stand by him until the end. That choice, simple as it seemed, became the turning point of my life. I didn't realize it then, but every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every bowl of beans and rice we shared was leading us to a moment that would shake my family to its core. Because when Grandpa's time came and his final wishes were revealed, the decision I made to take him in would change everything. The months I spent with Grandpa were the hardest and yet the most meaningful of my life. Every day I felt the weight of responsibility pressing on me. But I also felt something else, something deeper. I felt proud. Proud that I was giving back to the man who had once given me everything. He didn't have the ranch anymore, but in those final months he still had his dignity. I made sure of that. Then came the morning I dreaded most. The air in my apartment was quiet, too quiet. Usually I would hear the shuffle of Grandpa's slippers on the floor or the soft coughs as he made his way to the table where I always left him coffee. But that morning, there was nothing. When I walked into the bedroom, I found him lying still,
his hands folded across his chest, his breathing gone. I sank to my knees beside him. For a long time I couldn't move. I wanted to believe he would wake up if I just waited, that this was another one of his naps. But when I touched his hand, it was cold. The tears came fast and heavy. I whispered through the sobs, "Thank you, Grandpa. Thank you for everything." His funeral was small but filled with people who respected him. Old ranch hands, neighbors, and a few distant relatives came to pay their respects. My father stood at the front with my mother, his face a mask of composure, but I could see his impatience in the way he checked his watch. He wanted this over with, wanted to move on to whatever business he thought was more important. I stood by Grandpa's casket, silent, remembering the stories he told me, the lessons he drilled into me, and the love he gave freely until the very end. After the funeral, we were summoned to the lawyer's office for the reading of Grandpa's will. The air was thick with tension as we sat around the polished oak table. My father leaned back in his chair, a smug look tugging at his mouth as if he already knew he would walk out of that room richer than before. My mother sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes darting nervously between us. I sat on the other side, still raw from grief, not caring about the money, only wanting closure. The lawyer, a gray-haired man with a calm, steady voice, cleared his throat and opened the envelope. Henry Thompson left specific instructions regarding his estate. He began to his son, David Thompson, he left the $4 million from the sale of the ranch, with the condition that he provide his father with care, shelter, and dignity until his passing. My father's smirk grew wider. He glanced at me as if to say, "See, it was always meant for me." But the lawyer wasn't finished. However, he continued adjusting his glasses. Mr. Thompson also included a clause that has now been triggered. If at the time of his death, Henry Thompson was not under the care of his son, but instead under the care of another, then the estate would immediately and entirely transfer to that person. The room went silent. My mother gasped. My father's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of disbelief. The lawyer turned his gaze toward me. It is clear from both testimony and medical records that in the final months of his life, Henry Thompson resided with and was cared for by his grandson, Ethan Thompson. Therefore, by the terms of this will, the entire estate is to be transferred to Ethan. The words hung in the air like a hammer striking steel. My father shot up from his chair, his face red with anger. "This is ridiculous. He gave the money to me. That was his choice." The lawyer remained calm. It was his choice, yes. And it was also his choice to set conditions. He stated plainly, and I quote, "A fortune is wasted in selfish hands. Let it go to the one who shows me love when I have nothing left." He wrote those words himself. I sat frozen, my mind spinning. I had never thought about the money, never wanted it. All I wanted was to give my grandfather peace in his final days. And yet here I was, suddenly responsible for everything he had worked for, everything my father had squandered. My mother's eyes filled with tears. She turned to my father, her voice trembling. "David, he trusted you. He gave you everything, and you betrayed him." My father slammed his fist on the table. "This isn't over. I'll fight this." The lawyer shook his head. "You won't win." His instructions are airtight. He planned this carefully. He knew exactly what he was doing. For the first time in my life, I saw my father speechless. He sank back into his chair, his hands trembling, his pride shattered. The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone could feel the weight of Grandpa's judgment pressing down on us. As I left the office that day, papers in hand, I felt both overwhelmed and humbled. I hadn't asked for this. I hadn't planned for it. But Grandpa had seen something in me worth trusting. He had chosen me not for my strength or ambition, but for something far simpler: love. That realization hit harder than the money ever could. The inheritance wasn't just wealth. It was a responsibility, a message passed down from one generation to the next. And in that moment, I promised myself I would honor it. Walking out of that lawyer's office, I felt like the ground beneath me had shifted. The folder in my hands held documents that changed everything. $4, $2 million, a ranch's worth of blood, sweat, and years. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt heavy, like carrying the weight of my grandfather's last words. He had trusted me not because I wanted the money, but because I chose him when no one else did. My father refused to speak to me after that day. He stormed out of the office and didn't look back. For weeks he avoided me entirely. When he finally did face me, his words were bitter. "You think you earned this, Ethan? You didn't. He manipulated you, used you to punish me." I didn't argue. There was no point. Nothing I could say would cut through the bitterness in his heart. Deep down, I think he knew the truth. Grandpa hadn't left him behind out of spite. He had given him a chance to prove his love, and Dad had thrown that chance away. Mom struggled. She loved my father, but she also loved Grandpa. I could see the conflict tearing her apart. One evening, she came to my apartment. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded tightly, her eyes red from crying. "Your grandfather was right about you," she said softly. "You have his heart. You gave him the care he needed when no one else would. I don't know what your father will do, but I want you to know I'm proud of you." Her words brought me more peace than the inheritance ever could. She saw me. She understood. With the estate now in my name, I had to make decisions. I could have bought a new house, new cars, or lived a life of comfort. But every time I thought about using that money for myself, I heard Grandpa's voice in my head. "A man's worth isn't in his land, Ethan. It's in how he treats his family." I knew then what I had to do. The first step was honoring him in a way that would last. I bought back a portion of the ranch land that had been sold off, not the whole spread, but enough to keep a piece of his legacy alive. I restored the old barn, the one where he had taught me to saddle a horse and mend fences. I placed a plaque at the entrance with his name, not to show off wealth, but to remind everyone who stepped foot there of the man who built it with his bare hands. Next, I created a scholarship fund for local kids from ranching families. Grandpa always said the future belonged to the young, and too many families struggled to give their kids opportunities beyond the ranch. With part of the inheritance, I made sure those kids could pursue education, whether it was agriculture, veterinary science, or anything else that helped them chase their dreams. Every scholarship awarded carried Grandpa's name. The rest of the money I handled carefully. I kept enough to secure my own life, but I lived simply. I didn't want to become like my father, chasing status and possessions. I wanted to live in a way that would make Grandpa proud, a way that showed money was just a tool, not a measure of worth. As for my father, his anger never faded. He saw my choices as a betrayal, proof that I had taken his rightful place. I tried to reach out more than once, offering help, trying to mend what was broken, but he always turned me away. "Keep your charity," he snapped once. "I don't need your pity." It hurt, but I learned to accept that some wounds don't heal when pride stands in the way. Mom visited me often. She spent time at the ranch land I restored, walking the fields, sitting on the porch, and telling me stories of her younger years with Grandpa. She found peace there, and so did I. Together, we kept his memory alive. Looking back, the lesson is clear. Money can reveal the truth about people. It can show their greed, their fear, or their love. My grandfather's wealth didn't corrupt him. It didn't make him selfish. It gave him a chance to test the people closest to him. My father failed that test. But in his failure, I found a calling. Grandpa's final wish wasn't just to leave me an inheritance. It was to leave me with the responsibility of carrying his values forward. Respect, kindness, and love were worth more than any dollar amount. He trusted me to remember that when others forgot. Sometimes late at night I sit on the porch of the restored barn staring up at the same endless Montana sky we used to share. I hear his voice in my memory, calm and steady, reminding me of the lessons he gave me as a boy. "Ah, man's worth isn't in his land, Ethan. It's in how he treats his family." And in those moments, I realized that the true inheritance wasn't the money at all. It was the love he left behind, the lessons he planted in my heart, and the example he set until his very last day. That is what I carry forward. That is what I will pass on when it's my time to leave something behind. That was my story. It wasn't easy to live through, and it wasn't easy to share. But I believe my grandfather's lessons deserve to live on. If you felt something while listening, if this story touched you in any way, then I ask you to keep his legacy alive with me. Share it with someone who might need a reminder about the value of love and respect. Leave a comment and tell me what lesson you took away. Or share a story about someone in your life who left an impact like my grandfather did. And if you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and join me on this journey. Thank you for listening. I never imagined my wedding anniversary would turn into the most humiliating night of my life. We were seated at a long table in the middle of a crowded restaurant in downtown Chicago. The place was alive with clinking glasses, polite laughter, and the low hum of conversations from tables all around us. To anyone watching, it probably looked like a celebration, but I could already feel the storm coming. My wife Catherine sat beside me in her emerald dress, a diamond pendant catching the glow of the chandelier. Across from us were her closest friends, women she had known since college. Beside each of them sat their husbands, men in tailored suits, the kind who tossed their car keys onto the table without thinking twice. I saw the Lexus logos flashing back at me, a silent reminder of the gap between their world and mine. Catherine leaned back in her chair, twirling the stem of her wine glass between her fingers. Her friends had been talking about trips to Paris and the newest electric cars their husbands had purchased. I stayed quiet, trying to focus on the meal in front of me, but Catherine's voice cut through the air, sharp and mocking. "You know," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "while your husbands are out closing deals and driving Lexuses, mine is busy scrubbing toilets in Chicago." The laughter from the table was hesitant, but Catherine's smile widened as if she enjoyed twisting the knife. My chest tightened. I could feel my face heating, but I forced myself to sit still. I told myself it was just her way of joking, but I knew the truth. She meant every word. I tried to glance away, pretending to be absorbed by the candle flickering between us, but then Catherine rose to her feet. She lifted her glass high, her eyes gleaming with something I had never seen before: cold satisfaction. To new beginnings, she declared, "I want a divorce." The room froze. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Conversations at nearby tables died mid-sentence. Catherine's voice carried with a cruel clarity as she continued, "I've had enough of living with a janitor. I deserve a man who can give me the life I want. Someone rich. Someone who belongs at my side." My throat went dry. I searched her face, looking for a trace of hesitation, some sign that this was a cruel joke, but she only smirked as her friends whispered and exchanged glances across the table. I pushed my chair back. The legs screeched against the polished floor, breaking the silence. I could not speak. My voice was trapped beneath the weight of humiliation pressing down on me. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the restaurant. As the heavy doors swung shut behind me, the cold night air hit my face. I had never felt smaller. I had never felt more betrayed. I was not born with wealth or privilege. My name is Michael Harris, and for the past 6 years I have worked as a janitor in Chicago. Every morning I put on my uniform, lace up my work boots, and step into the steel and glass towers that scrape the sky. I sweep marble floors, polish chrome railings, and mop away the footprints of men in tailored suits who barely notice me as they pass by. To most people, I am invisible, but to me, my work is a badge of honor. It is proof that I can stand on my own 2 feet and provide for my family without stealing, without lying, and without depending on anyone else. The job is not glamorous, but I take pride in it. My hands are rough, my back is sore most nights. Yet there is a certain dignity in seeing the floors shine because of my effort. When I watch my reflection on a spotless surface that I cleaned, I remind myself that value is not found in titles or paychecks. It is found in the willingness to keep going when life is hard. Still, I would be lying if I said Catherine ever saw it that way. From the moment we moved to Chicago, she made it clear that the life I was building was not enough for her. She was drawn to the glittering storefronts on Magnificent Mile, the electric cars gliding silently down the avenues, the penthouses perched high above the city lights. She measured happiness and status symbols and luxury, while I measured it in honesty, family, and the quiet pride of knowing I never cut corners. At first, I tried to bridge the gap. I picked up extra shifts so she could shop for the clothes she wanted. I skipped meals to save for small vacations. I told myself that love was about compromise, that if I worked harder, she would see the man behind the uniform and not just the paycheck. But the harder I tried, the further she drifted. She stopped seeing me as her partner and began seeing me as the weight holding her back. What made the rejection sharper was the family I came from. My father, Richard Harris, built his name in business long before I was born. He was a man who believed in legacy and control. He expected his son to follow his path to inherit the empire he spent decades creating. But I was young, stubborn, and determined to make my own way. When I refused to step into his world, he told me I was throwing away a destiny most men would kill for. Our last conversation ended with me slamming a door, and for years we never spoke again. My mother, Margaret Harris, was the opposite of Richard in every way. She was gentle, patient, and endlessly encouraging. She taught me that money can vanish in a blink, but character endures forever. When Catherine mocked me when the world seemed eager to remind me that I was just a janitor, I would think of her voice. Michael. She used to say it does not matter if your shoes are worn thin. What matters is that you are walking on a path you can be proud of. My sister Emily is much younger than I am. She grew up watching me take the hits life threw my way, and she admired me for it. In her eyes, I was a protector, someone who proved that you could stand tall without bending to the pressure of others. She would call me between her college classes, telling me she bragged about me to her friends. I never told her how much that meant, but those words kept me steady more times than she will ever know. And then there was my grandfather, Samuel Harris. He was a man of stories, a voice of wisdom that carried through generations. He used to sit me on the porch when I was a boy and tell me about his own struggles during the war, about the years he spent with nothing but the clothes on his back, and a determination to survive. Hardship shapes a man, Michael, he would say, but it is how you carry yourself through it that determines who you become. His words never left me, and in many ways they built the backbone that Catherine could never see. That night at the restaurant, when Catherine raised her glass and stripped me of my dignity in front of strangers, the pain cut deep, but it was not new. It was the culmination of years of small cuts. The quiet disdain in her eyes when she looked at me in my uniform, the sighs she gave when the rent check drained our savings, the comparisons she made between me and her friends' husbands. Each moment had chipped away at the bond we once had until there was nothing left but contempt. I walked into that dinner already carrying the weight of her disappointment. My hands were calloused. My shirt smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals, and my back ached from hours of scrubbing. Still, I told myself it was worth it because this was our anniversary. I hoped foolishly that maybe tonight she would look past the uniform and see the man who loved her, the man who had sacrificed sleep and comfort to keep food on our table. Instead, she chose that night of all nights to announce to the world that she was done with me. The restaurant smelled of roasted garlic and fine wine, but I could barely taste the food in front of me. Catherine's friends were dressed in designer gowns, their jewelry catching the soft glow of the chandeliers. Their husbands sat tall in their suits, their Rolex watches glinting every time they lifted a glass. I sat among them in a shirt I had ironed 3 times to look sharp, but I still felt out of place. I tried to focus on the meal to keep the peace for the sake of our anniversary, but Catherine made it impossible. She was radiant in her emerald dress, but her beauty carried an edge sharpened by contempt. She leaned toward her friends with a smile that was too wide, too eager to impress. Every time the conversation turned toward luxury cars, vacations, or high-paying careers, I felt her eyes flick toward me with an unspoken message. You are not enough. Her friend Bethany bragged about her husband's new Lexus, describing how the doors lifted like wings. The table erupted in admiration. Catherine did not miss her chance. She tilted her glass toward me and said, "Meanwhile, my husband gets his cardio mopping floors. Who needs a Lexus when you have a mop bucket?" Laughter rippled across the table. It was not loud, but it was enough. My stomach twisted. I forced myself to swallow the rising anger, reminding myself that anger would only make it worse. I clenched my hands under the table and told myself to endure. I thought about saying something, but my voice caught in my throat. The pride I carried in my work, the lessons my mother and grandfather taught me, the resilience I built over years of labor, all of it shrank under her words. For Catherine, it was not enough. I tried to change the subject. I leaned forward and said, "I had a tenant thank me today for helping her carry groceries up the stairs." Made my day. I meant it as a reminder that small acts matter. But Catherine rolled her eyes. Groceries. Michael, please. These men are negotiating contracts and managing portfolios. You're bragging about carrying a grocery bag. Her friends smiled politely, but the damage was done. My attempt to restore dignity only fueled her disdain. As the plates were cleared, Catherine lifted her glass. I expected her to toast to our anniversary, maybe acknowledge the years we had spent together. Instead, she turned the evening into my trial. To new beginnings, she said, her voice rising above the clink of silverware. Her eyes swept across the table before landing on me. I want a divorce. The words cut through me like glass. At first I thought I misheard her. The table fell silent. Even the servers froze in place. My heart pounded against my ribs, loud in my ears. She went on, her voice steady and cruel. I am tired of living with a janitor. I deserve a man who can give me the life I want. Someone rich. Someone who belongs at my side. The room blurred. I saw her friends shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Husbands looking anywhere but at me. My chair suddenly felt too small. My body too heavy. Humiliation burned in my chest. A fire I could not put out. I wanted to speak to defend myself, but my mouth refused to move. My pride was trapped under the weight of her words. I thought of my sister Emily, who looked up to me as her protector. I thought of my mother Margaret, who told me dignity mattered more than wealth. I thought of my grandfather Samuel Harris, who believed hardship revealed character. All of them had given me strength, but in that moment, their lessons clashed with the raw sting of public shame. I pushed my chair back. The sound of its legs scraping against the polished floor pierced the silence. My heart ached, but my decision was clear. Staying at that table meant surrendering what little dignity I had left. I stood without a word. Catherine smirked, raising her glass higher, as if my silence proved her point. Her friends whispered, their eyes darting between us. I turned my back on the table and walked toward the door. Each step was heavy but necessary. The maitre d' tried to greet me politely as I left, but I could not meet his eyes. The restaurant doors swung open, and the cold night air of Chicago struck me like a slab. I stood on the sidewalk, my breath visible in the chill inside. Laughter slowly resumed, muffled by the glass. I stared at the lights of passing cars, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life. This was supposed to be our anniversary, a night to celebrate the years we had spent together. Instead, it became the night she announced my failure to the world. In that moment, I was not Michael, the husband, the brother, the son, or the grandson. I was just the man Catherine had reduced to a punchline. The city roared around me with taxis honking and voices rising from the streets, but all I heard was her voice echoing in my head. I deserve a man who can give me the life I want. The cold air bit at my skin as I stood outside the restaurant trying to steady my breathing. The humiliation from inside still clung to me like a second skin. People passed by without a second glance. Couples arm in arm laughing and hailing taxis while I stood frozen under the city lights. My hands trembled, though not from the chill. I had left my dignity behind at that table ripped away in front of strangers and so-called friends. I shoved my hands into my pockets and started walking. I did not know where I was going. Maybe home, maybe nowhere at all. The sidewalk was slick from an earlier rain, and the reflections of neon signs shimmered in puddles like broken pieces of glass. My mind replayed Catherine's words again and again. I deserve a man who can give me the life I want. Each time the pain struck harder, as though she were repeating them into my ear with every step I took. Half a block away, I leaned against a lamppost and lowered my head. For a moment, I wanted to disappear, to dissolve into the concrete and never face the world again. That was when I heard it. The low hum of an engine pulling up beside me. A sleek black car slowed to a stop. Its tinted window rolled down with deliberate slowness. Inside, a man in a dark suit leaned forward, his face stern, his eyes sharp as if they were measuring me. "Mr. Harris?" he asked, his voice deep and steady. I froze. My first thought was that Catherine had sent someone to mock me further, to drive the knife deeper. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, who's asking?" The man gave a small smile that did not reach his eyes. "Your father sent me." The words hit harder than Catherine's insults. My father, Richard Harris. A name I had not spoken in years. A man I had buried in silence because the pain of his disappointment weighed heavier than any insult my wife could throw. "What do you mean my father sent you?" I asked, suspicion dripping from my voice. "I have not heard from him in years." The man reached into the passenger seat and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with red wax. He held it out the window with a steady hand. "Your father told me to deliver this when the time was right. Tonight, he said, is the time." I stared at the envelope, my heart racing. My father's seal was unmistakable. A lion's head pressed into the wax, a symbol he had used on everything from his business contracts to birthday cards when I was a boy. I had not seen that seal since the night I walked away from him. I did not move at first. Part of me wanted to reject it, to tell the man he had the wrong person and keep walking, but curiosity nudged me. Slowly, I reached out and took the envelope from his hand. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind used by men who wanted to leave an impression. "What is this?" I asked, my voice unsteady. The man's gaze never wavered. "It is your father's message." His exact words were, "Tell my son it is time." The window slid up before I could ask more, and the car pulled away its tires, whispering against the wet pavement. Within seconds, it vanished into the blur of traffic, leaving me alone with the envelope clutched in my hands. I stood frozen under the streetlight, the sounds of the city around me fading into the background. My breath came in short bursts as I stared at the seal. Memories of my father surged like a flood, his stern voice teaching me about balance sheets, the sharp arguments when I refused to follow in his footsteps. The last look of disappointment in his eyes before I walked out for good. I had not heard from him since. Not on birthdays, not on holidays, not even when my mother Margaret pleaded for us to reconcile. I convinced myself he had cast me out forever. And now, after years of silence, a stranger in a black car was telling me he had been waiting for the right time to send me a message. I pressed my thumb against the wax seal, but I hesitated. Part of me was afraid of what I would find inside. Was it another lecture, a final insult from a man who believed I had wasted my potential? Or was it something else, something heavier, something I was not ready to face? I finally broke the seal and pulled out a folded letter.
My hands shook as I opened it, and the first line made my knees weaken. Michael, my son. If you are reading this, it means the day I have been waiting for has arrived. You have endured hardship and humiliation, but you have not broken. You have carried yourself with dignity even when the world mocked you. Now it is time to step into the role I always knew you were meant to claim. I read the words over and over, my throat tightening. For years I believed my father had abandoned me, but here he was speaking to me from the page as though he had been watching all along. At the bottom of the envelope was a set of brass keys, old and heavy with tags that bore numbers and addresses. I turned them in my hand, the metal cool against my palm, my reflection caught in their shine. My father's words echoed in my head. It is time. I stood in the street with the letter in one hand and the keys in the other, torn between anger at his silence and the sudden rush of hope that maybe, just maybe, I had been wrong about him all these years. The betrayal of my wife had broken me minutes before, but now another door was opening, one I never expected. I stood beneath the streetlight with the letter trembling in my hands and the brass keys heavy in my pocket. The city roared around me, but I heard none of it. All I could hear was my father's voice in the words he had written. It was as if he were standing beside me, steady and commanding, yet distant as he had always been. For years I had carried anger toward him. I believed he had abandoned me when I refused to follow in his footsteps, when I chose a life of independence over his empire. I convinced myself he wanted nothing to do with me, that I was no longer his son in his eyes. But now, staring at this letter, that belief began to crack. The words were not of rejection. They were of faith. You have endured hardship and humiliation, but you have not broken. You have carried yourself with dignity, even when the world mocked you. Tears threatened to rise, but I forced them back. I walked toward a bench on the corner and sat down, unfolding the rest of the letter. My father's handwriting was sharp and deliberate, every stroke of the pen carrying authority. Michael, you thought I turned my back on you. The truth is, I was watching. I needed to know if you could survive without leaning on me. I needed to see if you would build strength on your own. Only a man who has tasted struggle can be trusted with legacy. I withheld my hand, not out of hatred, but out of faith that you would prove yourself worthy. Tonight you have. The keys enclosed belong to properties, accounts, and businesses that are now yours. They will test you. They will demand everything of you, but they will also give you the chance to rise above the humiliation you endured and become the man I always believed you could be. I set the letter on my lap and stared at the keys. Dozens of memories rushed through me. The long nights scrubbing floors, the mornings where exhaustion made my hands shake, the shame of watching Catherine measure me against men who had everything I did not. My father had seen all of it, and instead of rescuing me, he had allowed me to carry the weight. And now, when I felt at my lowest, he had placed the burden and the blessing of his legacy into my hands. I clenched the keys tightly, the metal biting into my palm. A surge of emotion coursed through me. Anger at his silence, gratitude for his belief, and an overwhelming sense of vindication. For years, Catherine treated me like a failure, as though my worth was tied to the shine of a car emblem or the number of zeros in a bank account. Now, by sheer twist of fate, I stood holding proof that I was far more than she ever imagined. Yet what struck me most was not the wealth itself. It was the realization that my father had not abandoned me after all. He had been waiting for this moment, and in his eyes, I had passed the test. I rose from the bench, my grip on the keys firm. The city around me no longer felt cold and indifferent. The lights seemed brighter, the night air sharper, alive with possibility. A taxi slowed as if sensing my need for direction, and I stepped inside. The driver asked, "Where to?" I unfolded a small tag attached to one of the keys. It bore an address in the Gold Coast. My heart raced as I gave the driver the location.
When we arrived, I stepped out onto a quiet street lined with brownstones. The key slid smoothly into the lock of a wrought iron gate. Inside was a townhouse grand but not ostentatious, its windows glowing warmly against the night. My father had left this for me not as a gift, but as a responsibility. I walked through the rooms in awe. Polished wooden floors, shelves lined with books on business, finance, and history paintings that spoke of wealth and careful taste. It felt both foreign and familiar, like stepping into a piece of the life I had once rejected. On the dining table sat another envelope with my name written across it. I opened it and found a second letter shorter but even more direct. Michael, this is only the beginning. What you do next will define you. Do not let betrayal chain you to bitterness. Rise above it. Prove that integrity can rule as powerfully as ambition. I am watching, even if from afar, Richard. My legs weakened and I sank into a chair. The weight of everything pressed down on me, the betrayal of my wife, the years of labor, the silence of my father, and now this sudden inheritance that changed everything. Yet beneath the weight was a rising strength, a conviction I had not felt before. I thought of Catherine sitting at that restaurant table, smug and triumphant as she announced our end. She believed she had shattered me, but tonight was not my end. It was my beginning. When the clock struck midnight, I stood at the window looking out at the city that had once seemed so indifferent. For the first time in years, I felt taller than the skyscrapers themselves. The janitor who had been mocked and discarded was gone. A man with the weight of legacy. The keys to power and the fire of resilience now stood in his place, and though my father's voice was only ink on paper, I could hear him clearly. It is time. The morning after that night felt different. I woke in the townhouse my father had left for me, surrounded by silence and the weight of everything that had happened. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting warm patterns across the polished floor. For years I had lived in small apartments with thin walls and cramped rooms. Now I stood in a place that represented power, legacy, and a future I had never imagined. I brewed coffee in the kitchen, my hands steady for the first time in months. The bitterness of humiliation from the restaurant was still there, but it no longer consumed me. Instead, it fueled me. I thought about Catherine's smirk, her laughter, the way she had raised her glass to my ruin. She wanted to crush me that night to leave me broken. Instead, she lit the fire that would carry me forward. By noon, my phone buzzed with a call from her. I stared at the screen, her name glowing back at me. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part wanted to hear her voice now that the ground beneath us had shifted. I answered. Michael, she said, her tone softer than I had heard in years. I was upset last night. I didn't mean to humiliate you like that. I said nothing. I let the silence stretch until she rushed to fill it. I heard something this morning about you, about Richard. She paused as if choosing her words carefully. I didn't know your father was still connected to you. I didn't know you were heir to anything. Her words were cautious, but her intent was clear. Catherine, I said firmly, you did mean it. You wanted me to feel small. You wanted to cut me down in front of everyone because you measured me against your friends' husbands. And I came up short, but you were wrong. I was never small. I just chose a harder path. She tried to interrupt, but I raised my voice. You wanted wealth, and now you see it standing in front of you. But you lost me the moment you traded loyalty for greed. Her tone shifted, pleading. Now we can start over, Michael. We can be better. You can forgive me. Think about everything we've shared. I shook my head, though she could not see me. No, you wanted a man who could buy your happiness. Go find him. I hope he brings you all the Lexuses in the world, because what I have now is more than wealth. I have dignity, and that is something you never valued. I ended the call and let the silence of the townhouse embrace me. It was not triumph I felt, but clarity. Catherine had shown me who she was, and my father had reminded me who I was. Over the next few weeks, I stepped into the legacy my father left. I visited properties with my name on the deeds. I met with business partners who had known Richard for decades. They looked at me with surprise, at first unsure if the janitor's son could stand where Richard once did. But as I spoke with conviction and carried myself with the strength of my struggle, I saw their respect grow. Each day I walked into those meetings. I thought of the floors I once scrubbed, the janitor's cart I once pushed. I carried those memories with pride, not shame. They had shaped me into the man I was, the man who could shoulder responsibility without losing his integrity. And every night when I returned to the townhouse, I would take out my father's letter and read it again. His words reminded me that this was not a gift handed freely. It was a trust, a challenge, a chance to prove that character mattered more than titles. Months later, I passed the restaurant where Catherine ended our marriage. I stopped across the street and watched through the window as couples laughed and raised glasses in celebration. The pain of that night was still there, but it no longer owned me. Instead, it had become part of the story that shaped me. I smiled and walked away, not as the man who was humiliated, but as the man who rose from it. The lesson is simple. You are not defined by the insults of others or the weight of their expectations. You are defined by how you carry yourself when life knocks you down. Dignity, resilience, and loyalty are worth more than any car, any suit, or any fleeting status symbol. I lost a wife who never truly valued me, but I gained something far greater. Clarity, strength, and a legacy built not on appearances, but on endurance. And if my story reminds you of anything, let it remind you of this. Your worth is not measured by what others say you are. It is measured by the integrity you refuse to surrender.